Hey guys, welcome to another lecture. In this lecture, I'm going to talk to you about diabetes. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about glucose. Glucose is the fuel that our body uses for cell metabolism. So all the food that we take in and eat, a lot of it anyway, is broken down into glucose, and our body uses that for energy for the cells. It uses that to make ATP, which we've talked about before. The brain's need, however, for glucose parallels its demand for oxygen, i.e. it needs glucose. There are many different sources of fuel. There are different sugars. You've probably heard of like fructose or galactose. And those are different types of sugars. And then there's like, the fatty acids, the fats that we take in, and the proteins. And our body can also use those for energy. But the primary source of fuel is this molecule right here, and that's glucose. The brain can only use glucose. So the body's got to have a real tight control on glucose because of how much glucose the brain needs to function. And now I'll talk about the pancreas. These are kind of all the players that go into diabetes. So the pancreas is the next one here. And we've talked about it before. It's this kind of funny shaped organ right here. It sits in the retroperitoneal space, and what it does, among other things, is produces and releases digestive enzymes into the duodenum, and it releases a thing called insulin and another thing called glucagon into the blood. And these guys are going to be our blood sugar mediators. You've probably heard about blood sugar before, but I'm going to talk about it in this lecture. All right, so now we're zooming in on the pancreas. And we're looking at the tiny little cells, and there are these cells, or these areas, I guess, in the pancreas that are called the islets of Langerhans. And there are two different types of cells. There are the alpha cells, and they produce glucagon, which actually raises the blood sugar. And the beta cells produce insulin, and insulin lowers the blood sugar. So when we're talking about blood sugar, we're actually talking about the amount of sugar that's circulating in the plasma portion of your blood. So it's not the sugar that's stored in the cells. It's not stored anywhere. It's not the sugar that's being used. It's actually the amount of sugar that's in the blood. So glucagon raises blood sugar, and insulin lowers blood sugar. So insulin is a hormone. Again, it's produced by the islets of Langerhans in the pancreas. It's required for sugar to enter most cells, but the brain does not require insulin to use the sugar. So let me draw you a little picture here. So I'm going to draw this as a blood vessel. Let me change colors. We're going to have a few colors going here. Let's do some yellow. So that's your blood vessel. This is your cell. Maybe it's a muscle cell, or, whoops, it doesn't really go into the blood vessel there. Maybe it's a muscle cell. We'll call this a muscle cell. All right, and then let's get some more colors. New color here, blue is probably good. And this is our little sugar molecules in the bloodstream. So this again is your blood vessel. The blood's flowing through it, and your muscle cell is right here. So the glucose, which the muscle cell really wants, because muscle cells also use a lot of glucose, especially maybe say if you're running or doing some activity, or using your muscles for anything really, just walking around. It uses glucose. It uses glucose as a source of energy. So, let me get another color here so I don't mess you guys up or confuse you. Let's see, orange ought to work. So, the problem is the glucose can't just go into the cell. It has to have something to help it. It doesn't just diffuse across the cell. And that thing to help it is insulin. So, insulin is kind of like this little helper molecule here that allows the glucose to go into the muscle cell. Go back to blue. So now I've got the insulin, and the insulin it kind of like is a key to a door, and it opens it and it lets the glucose go into the muscle cell. So what that does is now that the glucose has gone into the muscle cell because of the insulin, less glucose is in your sugar, or less glucose is in your blood. So your blood sugar goes down. Your muscle sugar goes up. Remember your blood glucose level, or your BGL, blood glucose level, because it's in the blood, drops with insulin. So that's what insulin does. Insulin makes it so that your muscle cells and your kidney cells and your liver cells and all of the other cells in your body except, whoops, oh my goodness, except brain cells, right? Because you know the brain, so the brain doesn't require insulin. The sugar can just go into the brain for whatever reason. The brain's extra special in that sense, that it doesn't require insulin to get the glucose from the bloodstream into the brain cells. So this is true for all cells right here. All cells except for brain cells require insulin, and nerve cells. So insulin is required to open up the cell to allow glucose to go in. What that does ultimately is it drops down the amount of glucose that's available in the bloodstream. And that can actually be a problem. The biggest organ that's a problem for is for the brain. So if you have too much insulin and you've opened up too many of these cells and all of your sugar in your blood has gone into your muscle cells and your kidney cells and your liver cells, there's nothing left for the brain. So the brain requires a fairly tight control over blood sugar levels. All right, so enter diabetes. Diabetes is a metabolic disease characterized by inadequate or absent insulin production. So you either aren't making any insulin or it's not enough. You're not making enough of it. So going back here to our little picture, that means that no insulin means the glucose stays in your blood. And the brain uses it, so the brain's doing okay, right? Because it doesn't require insulin. But this muscle cell, it's not getting any sugars. It's not the kidney cells and the liver cells. They're not getting any sugar either. They're certainly not getting enough. So that becomes a problem. And that means that you have too much sugar in your bloodstream and not enough sugar in your muscle cells and other cells. So that's diabetes. This other half is diabetes mellitus. Sometimes you'll see this abbreviated DM. There's another type of diabetes called diabetes insipidus, but that is a much more rare condition. When you say somebody has diabetes, we're generally speaking referring to diabetes mellitus. So there are two different types, and you guys may have heard about these different types in the news. Type 1 diabetes means that you have no insulin production. So your pancreas doesn't work. Pancreas doesn't work. It's not producing insulin. These patients have to take insulin injections. There's no other option for these patients. And typically type 1 diabetes is a juvenile onset. So these kids may be 8 or 10 or 12 years old when it happens. So the pancreas is basically not doing its job. It's not producing any insulin at all. Contrasted with that is type 2 diabetes. And in this, your pancreas is working, but it's either not producing enough insulin or the tissues, like your muscle cells and your kidney cells and liver cells, they have a resistance to the effects of insulin. This can either be controlled with diet, oral medications, and there's a long list: diabeta, diabetes, Dimalor, glucotrol, micronase, oronase, tolinase, and glucophage, among others. There are always more of these coming out. And as the disease progresses, these patients may need insulin injections.